Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. I am Magda Tedder, and I'm the Shtetlach Chair in Judaic Studies, and I'm delighted to welcome you today to another lecture in our New York Public Library Fordham Lecture Series in Jewish Studies. Today's lecture by Dr. Aleksandra Szczepan is part of a joint program of Fordham Center for Jewish Studies and the New York Public Library's Dorot Jewish Division, bringing scholars from outside of the New York metropolitan area to Fordham and the NYPL. We launched this program in 2017 and brought our first fellows in 2018. Over the last several years, we have hosted over 20 scholars, and this year approaching 30 in Jewish studies from around the world, from 4 continents, North America, South America, Europe, and Asia, stretching from Argentina to France to Israel, Poland, and across the US, just to mention a few. Before I introduce Aleksandra, our speaker today, I want to thank the NYPL and especially the Dorot Jewish Division, Mila Sholochova and Matt Knudsen for helping this partnership flourish. I am grateful to the advisory council here of our Center for Jewish Studies and so many of you for your generosity. The fellowship program has been funded over the years by the Picket Family Foundation and the Knapp Family Foundation, the latter of which has allowed us to expand the program for the 3 years to offer a full year fellowship. We have an exciting slate of fellows this year. Dr. Anna Sierka is here for the full year. Writer Rachel Kadish will be with us next spring, as well as Drs. Lior Jacobi, Miyuki Kita, and Adam Farkas will come in the spring as short-term fellows. And of course, my gratitude goes to Siobhan Verletza for everything she does for our center, make sure that all our events are well organized. And to my colleague Emmanuel Fiano, as co-director of the center this year. Now, let me introduce our speaker, Aleksandra Szczepan, who is a literary scholar and a co-founder of the Research Center for Memory and Cultures at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. She has been also a researcher and an interviewer for the oral history projects undertaken by the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Poland and Spain and Kazakhstan. Dr. Szczepan has received scholarships and fellowships and grants from various institutions, including the very US Holocaust Memorial Museum, but also Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies, the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, and the Polish National Science Center. She's currently, of course, a fellow. She was a fellow, short-term fellow here of the New York Public Library in Fordham, and is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Potsdam. She is working on a book project that explores the significance of maps and mapping as testimonies in the Holocaust research, about which I'm sure we'll hear more today. Before I hand out the screen to Dr. Szczepan, I want to invite you to join us next week on Wednesday, November 6th, right after the election day here in the United States, for some fun and food with artist Siona Benjamin. We will watch a short documentary about Siona Benjamin's art and her project documenting the B'nai Israel community in Mumbai, where Siona grew up. After the screening, Amy Levine Kennedy, the curator of the Koslova Gallery, and our colleague here at Fordham will speak with Siona about her art and current projects, and we will finish the evening with a dinner reception of kosher Indian food. So join us in person, and if you can't join us in person, we hope you'll join us online. So now let's turn the screen over to Dr. Szczepan, and I look forward to learning from you. I'll send you the links to the other events shortly, and please feel free to ask questions or make comments in the Q&A section of the screen. Thank you very much. Ola, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind introduction. And I would like to express my great gratitude to Fordham University and New York Public Library for hosting me last month, and especially to Magda Teter and Mila Szlochova for their support and kindness and inspiration. I slightly changed the topic of my talk from Eastern Europe to Poland, as I feel more comfortable in this slightly revisioned space frame. All right. On 19 April 1948, on the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the exhibition Martyrdom and Struggle at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, Poland was opened. Among the photographs the Jewish-Polish photographer Julia Picket took at this event, there is a photo of the map entitled Liquidation, in Yiddish Destruction of Polish Jewry. It comprises a white sheet marked with the contours of post-war Poland and a myriad of dots indicating life and death of Polish Jewry. This map has a complex temporality. Although the borders display the post-1945 order, the dots of Jewish cities and towns reach much further to the east, including in the calculus of losses all Jewish Polish pre-war communities. All the places of life have a date in a colored rectangle that might mean liquidation, deportation, or resettlement. The names without numbers are the ones marked with black dots circled in red, the sites of death only, such as Treblinka or Bełżec. On this map, the time was compressed to narrate the history of the Holocaust in Poland within its aftermath, indicated by post-war borders, and to make present the enormity of life lost. This is the map of Jewish Poland. But processual temporality of the map shown at the Martyrdom and Struggle exhibition is also inscribed in its very creation. As the copy of the earlier version of the map kept at the Jewish Historical Institute documents. As we can see, the previous sketch of the map does not contain the death camps, which are only suggested in pencil. Also, some of the places in the eastern borderlands were added only later. The sketch is unquestionably a work in progress. Yet, it is interesting that the first impulse of the creator was to represent the loss through the multitude of Jewish towns and cities, rather than sites connected only with death. Moreover, the map shown at the exhibition was updated even after its official debut, and another sites of Jewish geography were added with handwriting, such as Dukla and Jeśliska. I myself grew up in Krosno, 20 kilometers from Dukla, so these locations are part of my intimate landscape. In a sense, the 1948 map performatively calls for a perpetual and never completed effort to map the Jewish again and again with more and more detail. The cartographic impulse is the one to give evidence. As S.L. Schneiderman wrote in his 1947 travelogue Between Fear and Hope about yet another early map of the Holocaust, I quote, "Books were not adequate, that a map was needed to give a truly graphic picture of the Nazi crimes on Polish soil," end of quote. But Pirot's photo of the map shows us something more than a cartographic document. She captures the map as an object of animated discussion of a group of men standing in front of it. Perhaps they are debating other matters, but they might also share their stories incited by the map. This is the power of intimate cartography, to touch or at least to point to the place where one was born or lost their family in front of others, to discuss trajectories of death and survival, gives a momentary feeling of agency and understanding one's history better. But it also creates a chance for community, formed from discrete stories joined together. In this brief moment documented by Pirot, the map ceases to be mere visual evidence of atrocities. It becomes testimony. In this presentation, I would like to follow these two lines of thinking about maps as Holocaust testimonies that were caught on film by Julia Pirot. Therefore, one is that mapping the Holocaust can be understood not as a task of this engaged cartographer, but also as the most intimate and committed act of bearing witness. Maps in the hands of Holocaust survivors, maps created, used, and referred to by them, as well as their complex status as performative, material, and testimonial objects, will be in the center of my attention. The other is the intuition that mapping always creates a community, however troubled. To elaborate on these insights, I will focus here on a specific body of cartographic documents, namely plans of shtetlach, how predominantly Jewish pre-war towns in Eastern Europe are called in Yiddish, and their surroundings, included in Yizker-Bikher. Yizker-Bikher, to explain briefly second Yiddish term, are books commemorating Jewish communities destroyed during the Holocaust, created by the survivors after the Second World War, and published mostly in Israel, Argentina, US, and France. I will concentrate on the Yizker-Bikher created by the communities coming from Poland. Poland in its pre-war borders, however, in order to follow the gesture of mapping life, death, and survival of Polish Jewry performed by the map hung on the wall of the Jewish Historical Institute in 1948. Places that belong to the map of pre-war Poland constitute the majority of towns and cities commemorated by Yizker books, whose total number amounts to circa 800 volumes. My examples will come from the books I paged through during my research stay at the New York Public Library. Therefore, I will argue that, firstly, the constantly growing collection of Yizker-Bikher, since there have been written, published, reprinted, and translated until now, may be interpreted as a continuation of the map presented at the Martyrdom and Struggle exhibition at the Jewish Historical Institute in 1948. This multifaceted and multi-authored anthology may be seen as a perpetual and never completed endeavor to map Jewish Poland as a place of life, death, and survival, of loss, but also of attachment. Secondly, I would like to focus on the cartographic documents included in Yizker-Bikher and show how memorial books are geographically embedded texts, and how they engage and encourage various forms of mappings, understood very broadly as spatial practices and processes of representing spatial complexity. Yizker mappings, as I will call them, are both documents of individual and collective memory, as well as remembering and commemorating people and places that have been lost. And they are vehicles of tender geographies, tools of bearing witness to the Holocaust, and platforms to create communities. Maps have always constituted an essential framework of Holocaust testimony. They were sketched by survivors in immediate aftermath of the mass murder, served as evidence during war crime trials, were published as a part of memoirs and memorial books, and donated to their archives. Maps, together with family photographs, were also kept by the survivors in their private archives and became a vital part of their video testimonies recorded for the biggest video archives. These documents might represent caps or surroundings of survivors' hometowns or villages, be hand-drawn or sketched with different levels of cartographic accuracy. They may have the form of topographic maps, such as a plan of a town, a small-scale map of Europe, or one particular country, simply adjusted with individual signs, drawings, and colors. Or they might be, as in the case of some video testimonies, official printed maps, which only in the performative act of bearing witness gain their testimonial qualities. These various maps are used by the witnesses for multiple purposes: to prove their credibility during trials and right to give a testimony, to demonstrate intimate local knowledge and embeddedness in prior locations, to show almost impossible trajectories from the past to the present with a pen or a finger, to narrate survival, hiding, escape routes, points of betrayal or help, to mourn loss of relatives, to invigorate the witness's own memory, to engage the interviewer with the realities of their story, to pass their knowledge about the lost space to the next generation, but most importantly, maps sustain the relation with the space of experience. For in case of survivors' video testimonies, the majority of the accounts were recorded far away from the places where the history happened. My inspiration for this project comes from an oral history project I took part in as a researcher and interviewer in 2018. It was undertaken by the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and dedicated to the Holocaust in Lviv, remembered by the ethnically Polish residents of the city. Sometimes after or before the interview, a witness would insist on showing me places of importance for the account on the historic Polish pre-war map of Lwów, the former Polish name of the city. They would point out where they lived, where they went to school, but also where the ghetto was or where they saw a particular instance of violence. It was the very performative act of mapping, situating memory, that seemed to be of utmost importance. It carried power of legitimizing their narrative, ones that were deported from the city due to the post-war resettlements, anchoring it in an objective grid of topographical city map. But it was also a very embodied performance between maps and their users, in which tender gestures of pointing a finger at the lost locations, touching the map with Polish names of streets, allow the witnesses to recreate their spatial experience, help them understand their own story and the events they eyewitnessed. On the other hand, this recurrent mapping performance was also an epitome of a certain futility of acts of giving testimony about traumatic events. A map only pretends to be an anchor of reality, and there is always a lacuna in an act of remembering that urges a witness to compulsively move their finger again and again along the streets that saw the events which cannot be undone. In the context of testimony, maps thus may constitute much more than mere visual representations of a given space. For witnesses, they are vehicles of tender geographies, to use Juliana Bruno term, of personal stories, but also a way of dealing with traumatic past. For the recipients of Holocaust testimonies, maps may be objects of various expectations about accessibility of the traumatic experience, about the possibility to communicate the past, or to comprehend the magnitude of the catastrophe of the Holocaust. This is why I propose to think about the significance of maps as testimonies in Holocaust research. My goal is to treat maps as points of complex exchanges that constitute the act of giving a testimony. My theoretical framework here is critical and post-representational cartography. The first one shows how the map is a political tool of authority and knowledge. It tends to treat some terrains as empty space and literally pushes some people off the map. The second focuses on the ontological status of maps and treats maps as processes, embodied social and political practices rooted in action and affective structures. In this context, we may look at Holocaust maps to understand how survivors remembered and narrated their experiences, how they dealt with their trauma, how they negotiate between themselves the meaning of the past. Thus, how testimony is always a relational, processual, and performative act. Holocaust maps may be vehicles of various meanings, desires, and expectations. They may reflect imagined geographies of both victims and perpetrators, constitute both intimate and public evidence of experienced past, serve as means of intergenerational communication. Looking at Holocaust maps, I argue, prompts us to demystify and problematize seemingly neutral categories of the Holocaust archive, to trace patterns of imagination that have been present in mainstream Holocaust reflection, and to rethink our expectations and projections in contact with a Holocaust testimony. My project, tentatively entitled Intimate Cartographies, Maps as Holocaust Testimonies, explores therefore various instances of mapping the Holocaust. Firstly, as a colonial practice towards Eastern Europe before and during the Second World War. Secondly, the synchronous mappings of the catastrophe by Jewish victims, from within, from camps and ghettos, and from afar, from distant sites of refuge during the Holocaust. Thirdly, post-war mappings for accountability during war trials and investigations, mapping to remember in Holocaust video testimonies, mapping alliances between survivors and people who stayed in the lands of their pre-war lives and sufferings. Finally, the performative mappings of non-Jewish neighbors who stayed in post-Holocaust Eastern Europe, who used vernacular maps, walks, and gestures to remember what happened in their villages and towns. Rather than using tools of digital humanities to visual topographies of the Holocaust, I focus on concrete maps created and used by Holocaust witnesses to understand space as a frame of experience, memory, and testimony. Moreover, my main focus are the documents referring to the territories to the east of the well-known and researched extermination camps. For long, Western scholarship was not interested in this landscape. In recent years, this status quo has been undergoing a major shift, however. However, the space of Eastern Europe is still interpreted within few visual and conceptual cues. The terra incognita of the East remains, firstly, an object of the orientalizing gaze shaped by Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, idyllic yet sinister landscapes, a post-genocidal wilderness. Secondly, the contemporary space east from Auschwitz tended to be considered as unspecified, unmappable void. The othering perspective on these terrains stemmed from the colonial bias of the West, the geopolitical isolation during communism, and the dispersed character of the Holocaust in the East, an immense multitude of killing sites and their visual indistinction. This bias is visible in the cartographic initiatives of classical Holocaust studies, epitomized by the map opening Martin Gilbert's well-known Atlas of the Holocaust, in which Auschwitz is the only death camp and, to the east of this point, stretches out an almost entirely white space, but also in eminent metaphors recently employed to grasp the phenomenon of Eastern Europe, such as Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, Martin Pollack's Kontaminierte Landschaften, or Martin Winston's Dark Heart of Nazi Europe. The good example to understand how map may be conceived as Holocaust testimony is the Treblinka death camp, one of the dots circled with red color on the 1948 map, a place often rendered as unmappable, yet restlessly mapped by its survivors. The site of the camp, during its functioning deceptively camouflaged as a farmhouse, later on was completely demolished and planted with lupin by the Nazis as part of a dismantling of the Operation Reinhardt camps designed to hide their crimes. Subsequently, the site was devastated by local residents digging for gold and valuables. When one enters the terrain of the camp, it is impossible to realize what was there, journalist Mordechai Tsanin commented in his 1952 travelogue of Stones and Ruins. The uncertain status of the camp, when it operated and after its destruction and further devastation, and the fact that no official Nazi plans of the camp existed, prompted survivors to create dozens of plans and models representing Treblinka. Maps of the camp became proof of its existence. Treblinka survivor Richard Glaser, in the interview recorded for the Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive, explained, I quote, "The plans are important because there are hardly any photographs and actually everything has been destroyed. This plan is so important because there was nothing left, like in other camps like Mauthausen or Dachau," end of quote. And for an hour of his testimony, he described how Treblinka camp functioned using his own map that he made just after the liberation. But the first preserved sketches of the camp come from as early as the autumn of 1942, when the first escapees from the camp reached the Warsaw Ghetto and gave their testimonies to the underground archive of the ghetto Ojnek Szabes. Most published memoirs by Treblinka survivors are complemented by sketches or plans of the camp. The plan drawn by Jankel Wiernik served him as a base to build a model of Treblinka that has been exhibited at the Ghetto Fighters' House in northern Israel since 1959. It is not a coincidence that the photos of Jakob Wiernik's model were the only visual representation of camp during the trial of Nazi official Adolf Eichmann in Israel in 1961. The cartographic impulse of mapping the the destruction, both documenting and bearing witness to the tragic events in Jewish history, may be also traced in memorial books, Yizker-Bikher, from the earliest instances of the genre. For instance, in 1937, Yizker book from Felsztyn, small town near Proskurov, now Khmelnytsky in western Ukraine, maps are used to tell the story of the pogrom perpetrated by Ukrainian soldiers during the Ukrainian War of Independence in February 1919, which took lives of 500 Jewish Felsztynians. I will shortly discuss these images, even though Felsztyn does not belong to topography of Jewish Poland, since it was an Ukrainian town before the war, and despite the fact that they portray the events prior to the Holocaust. 3 map-like images were included in the book, all of them created by artist Nota Kozlowski. First one is the pictorial map, Bildliche Mapa in Yiddish, inserted at the very beginning of the book. Second is the map punctured by a bayonet with caption slaughter. Third one is the image of skull imposed on the map with the caption Felsztyn looked like a skull. Barbara Mann, who in her book The Object of Jewish Literature analyzed Kozlowski's illustrations from Felsztyn Yizker-Bikher, wrote about these images that, I quote, "they seem more interested in creating a mood for readers than in actually communicating anything particular to the place," end of quote. Yet it seems to me that in many respects, Felstein pictorial maps can be understood as Yizker mappings and cartographic testimonies. Firstly, they render the intimate space of the shtetl with its topographic characteristics that can be recognized by its former inhabitants and therefore discussed and identified together. Secondly, they visually evoke the historical event of the pogrom, since the murder was committed with the use of bayonets. Thirdly, they serve as a tool of commemoration and mourning, thanks to their visual form that depicts the space that became a cemetery. Following this interpretation of Felstein images, we may treat the enormous collection of Yizker-Bikher as a collective effort to map the space that corresponds with this dialectical image from Felstein book. Peaceful and intimate place of belonging that at the same time looks like a skull, space of both life and death, loss and survival. But we can also look at real maps that were included in these books and examine them as a diverse corpus of cartographic documents, corpus that I would like to approach from three angles, analyzing material, temporal, and performative forms of Yizker mappings. Not every post-war memorial book contains a map, but most of them do, and these documents constitute one of the most prominent cases of cartographic testimonies of the Holocaust. Hand-drawn and often inaccurate, the maps included in Yizker-Bikher usually show Jewish Eastern Europe from before the Holocaust. Many of them, however, map the Holocaust as well, adding to the pre-war Jewish fabric of towns signs of the catastrophe, such as ghettos, camps, points of deportation, and killing sites. These documents may vary to a great extent in their scope, size, and form. They may represent a country, a region, a singular shtetl, or even its part, as here in the case of Zduńska Wola ghetto. They may be copied from books and official documents, hand-drawn, or adjusted with a simple gesture of usually unnamed amateur cartographer. As in the case of the map in the Memorial Book of Nowy Sącz, in which the ghetto was inserted to a historic map of the town by fast movements of writing hand and kept there in this shape in print. Memorial books differ also in their cartographic intensity. While some have one small map reprinted from another source, others days with abundance of mappings, as is the case of the Book of Brzeżany, now Bereżany in Ukraine, from 1978, which is a document of extraordinary cartographic potential, as it contains as many as 10 different maps and 19 plans. The historical existence of Brzeżany is rendered with help with historical maps, such as maps of historical monuments of the region or 7055 plan of local castle. But the most striking is the use of the map from the inside cover, which is performatively repeated throughout the book to narrate the fates of the community before and during the war. You can see one of the instances of this map on the right. It serves as a base to represent the Jewish religious community, but also the story of the ghetto and labor camp with additional markings. Another striking document used in the book is the plan of Jewish hideout that brings the intimate architecture and topography of survival of several Jewish families on the left. The cartographic framework is essential for Brzeżany book structure, also literally. The map of the shtetl fills its inside cover. And indeed, materiality of Yizker mappings is one of their most interesting aspects. While usually they are contained within a page as a traditional visual representation, sometimes they become the very tissue of a book itself, as a cover image, inside covers, or oversized sheets folded in books. As such, they grow old with the book being stored on a bookshelf, tear up with excessive use, get worn and yellow in the corners. These maps are to be touched with tenderness and studied with care, alone and together, within and across generations. The material aspect of Yizker mappings gets irreversibly lost in the process of digitalization, when their sheer size, but also tactility, cracks and scars, get flattened and dropped down. The same happens with colors that happen to animate cartographic representations of shtetlach, but also emphasize the events that maps try to record and narrate. As in the case of the spectacular map of Pinsk, where on the yellow grid of streets and buildings, black elements were imposed, from order of life, such as sunbathing or fishing on the bottom, and death, such as mass grave in the left corner. This contrast and materialities are lost in the digital version of the map, available thanks to the great effort of scanning all available Yizker-Bikher undertaken as a joint initiative on New York Public Library and Yiddish Book Center. This is why the pictures I am using today show mostly maps in their material form, photographed in the New York Public Library. Temporality, as we could have seen in the case of the map shown at the Jewish Historical Institute, is another fundamental element of maps and cannot be overlooked. In abrupt strokes that introduce the borders of the ghetto to the map of Zabudów, we may grasp compressed timeline of ghettoization. In the drawing of Tyszowce, the violence is embedded in the very landscape of the town that maps tries to represent. One of the flows of the river embracing the shtetl that is represented on this drawing was filled in with soil by Jewish forced laborers during the Second World War. Temporality is also ingrained in the language aspect of the map. Polish continues to be an invisible, ghostly underpinning of most of the Yizker-Bikher of communities coming from pre-war Poland, which are written in Yiddish, Hebrew, and English. Yet it almost never surfaces as a language of betrayal of previously shared community. But maps somehow allow Polish to emerge. Therefore, interestingly, relatively often maps in memorial books are bilingual, Yiddish and Polish or Hebrew and Polish, and sometimes even happen to be only in Polish, as in the case of the map from the Book of Szydłowiec. Official Polish names of places were imposed on topographical imagination of all residents of shtetlach and cities, regardless their languages, ethnicities, and religious or political affinities, and somehow persevered in this linguistic form in memory of the survivors. Thanks to their multilingual form, Yizker mappings preserve a sense of diverse, intimate communities that Yizker books keep memory of. But memorial books actively map Jewish Poland not only in purely cartographic form. We may look for other performative mappings, namely spatial practices of remembering, whose traces are recorded by the books. One of them will be imaginative walks that authors of Yizker-Bikher urge us to take, such as Tour around Shtetl in Brzozów book, or Walk through the Shtetl in Rzeszów book, or post-war photographic documentation of formerly Jewish towns included in the books, either in the form of a sober Bedecker, as in the case of Korczyna, or more direct catalogue of Jewish sites, houses, and institutions, as in the case of Tarnów. You can see these places signaled with the crosses and arrows. These performative forms of mappings comprise also the most poignant instances of mapping the death, such as photos of survivors who with their own bodies mark the unmarked graves of members of their community, as in the photos included in the books of Ostrowiec Świętokrzyski or Korzec. Finally, as I stated at the beginning, maps are most importantly vehicles of community. First of all, among their displaced creators of the books negotiating the shape of a plan of a town. The dialogue between maps from different Yizker books related to the same place might be an example of negotiations within a community that is, however, unified by shared geographical belonging, as in the case of two books of Siedlce. But I am also interested in performative acts of mapping the space of Jewish Poland undertaken with use of plans from memorial books by various actors, above all, Holocaust survivors, representing disparate ecologies of witnessing, to use Hanna Polingalai's term that denotes complex contexts, environments, and languages within which witnesses give their testimonies. But also survivors' alliances with their descendants, and those who stayed on site, non-Jewish residents of former Polish shtetlach. In case of Nehemia Wurman, Holocaust survivor interviewed on 15 October 1987 in Toronto, map from Yizker book enables him to relate to his own history and at the same time communicate his experience to future generations. Wurman was born in Kurów in Lublin area, then deported to Ostrowiec Świętokrzyski ghetto and labor camp, from which he escaped to the forest. Then he went to Opatów and later to Sandomierz. At the end of his interview, the witness tells again his wartime itinerary using two maps. One is the Polish Hebrew plan of Ostrowiec from the Yizker book published in 1971 in Tel Aviv, that the witness uses to narrate wartime change of space of the town and personalizes it with own topographic elements and colors. Blue line delimits space of the Ostrowiec ghetto that he had to move to. Brown one indicates its shrinking. Red signifies a mass execution on the market square in October 1942, and green, the site of forced labor in the steelworks. He also uses a copy of map of the region that he adjusted by hand. Places of his and his family's wartime suffering are marked with yellow and green brushes. With yellow and green brushes are used for thick forests near Janów and Sandomierz, where Jewish partisans, including his brother, were operating and where he found refuge. Wurman speaks from distant ecology, geographical, temporal, imaginary. For 40 years, he had lived far away from the space of Eastern Europe. He speaks in English, and Yizker mapping allows him to navigate in his own memory, but also to, in a sense, maintain the topography of Ostrowiec as a real place of his past. A trace of mapping alliance may be spotted in a memoir, Traveling Heavy, by Ruth Behar, Cuban-American second-generation anthropologist and writer. Behar describes how in 2009 she decided to visit Poland and the former shtetl of Gaworowo, from where her grandmother originated. She takes with her the Gaworowo Yizker book that contains a plan of shtetl, which she hopes will help her navigate the foreign space. Yet the topography of a small town somehow doesn't match its cartographic representation, not so much because of its factual inaccuracies, but rather affective dissonances it causes. I quote, "I was suddenly overwhelmed by the futility of this visit. To come all this distance to look at a hometown my grandmother had had no desire to see again." End of quote. Only when Behar meets Mr. Grinberg, a Jewish survivor from Gaworowo, the significance of the Yizker book and its maps changes for her. I quote, "This book I had been so reluctant to bring with me now felt like the only thing in the world that had been worth carrying to Poland." End of quote. To find Yiddish Gaworowe in Polish Gaworowo, she needed a link of a Jewish life from a local ecology that would make the space readable and relatable. Behar's memoir may be read as a variation of the Testimonies of Return, both written and video recorded, documenting travels to the old country undertaken by survivors and their descendants. This might have been both private journeys and trips organized by Landsmannschaften, some of which made their way to Holocaust archives as cinematic documents, such as documentaries about Łańcut or Słonim, in which survivors tell the story of shtetlach navigating through present space with help of Yizker-Bikher maps, as well as through encounters with those who remained, usually non-Jewish neighbors. One example of these recorded journeys is Szymon's Returns, a 2014 film by Sławomir Grunberg and Katka Reszke, following Israeli historian and Holocaust survivor Szymon Redlich, who goes back to his shtetl Brzeżany in Eastern Borderlands, now Berezhany in Ukraine, in Ternopil Oblast. Redlich's return is punctuated by two written accounts. First is already mentioned here Brzeżany Yizker book. The other, Redlich's 2002 memoir Together and Apart in Brzeżany, in which he commented on his failed attempts to use the map of space he viscerally knew. I quote, "I had been chasing my past and my childhood for some time. I repeatedly examined the map of the town and old family photographs. I was both eager and scared to return. My maps and drawings didn't help much. Names of streets had been changed several times, from Polish into German, then into Russian, and finally into Ukrainian. Polish Brzezany had become a Ukrainian town. End of quote. Yet in the documentary film that I mentioned, Szymon's Return, which documents Redlich's visit to his shtetl, we can observe a situation that goes somehow against these observations. Redlich follows on the screen the path of the last march of 1,400 Brzezany Jews towards the local cemetery, the Okopisko, where they were shot on 12th of June 1943, among them Redlich's father. When he tries to navigate this traumatic geography, he suddenly appears to be somehow at ease, regardless the pain that it brings. He is rightful-rooted user of Brzezany, his home space. I used to live in Brzezany. I am a Jew, he says in Ukrainian, asking for directions one of his fellow Brzezanians. My last example is a story of a potential mapping encounter that could happen over the map of Gombin, a shtetl in central Poland. It was made by Wolf Mancyk from Gombin, Yizker-Bikher, and donated in an augmented form to the local museum by the descendants of Jews of Gombin. So it can remind its contemporary Polish residents about the town's largely Jewish past, but also to be a site of negotiations, as map was gifted in two language versions, Polish and English. Maps, therefore, have a special ability to facilitate these potential precarious communities. Nothing makes one more grounded than finding themselves on the map. I would like to end this presentation on a personal note, since my positionality is also a factor here. As I mentioned before, I grew up in a former shtetl in eastern Poland that lost in Bełżec most of its Jewish citizens. This is why many of the examples I show today come from eastern Poland, Rzeszów region. In these terrains, I navigate with ease, yet often stumble in confusion, learning that the space I know by heart used to have a different dominator, and places within it are invisible or destroyed, or unjustly acquired by the majority group that I belong to. This is another proof, I would like to believe, of special potential of Yizker mappings. They help us understand the significance of space, not only in grasping how the Holocaust happened from a historical point of view, but also in the dynamics of dealing with trauma and conveying the past. They are at the same time elements of the tender geographies of those who left and cartographic testimonies of intimate violence in multiple discrete sites of the Holocaust. Yizker mappings are special representations and special objects, both personal and communal, private and public, idiosyncratic and evidential, perpetual and fixed in time. As such, they epitomize the most compelling paradoxes that are embedded in the memorial books themselves, and therefore invite us to continue their endeavor to map and to remember Poilin. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ola, for this really fascinating talk. I've learned so much. I think we often use maps as simple illustrations of space. And what you've done in your work, in your talk, you showed us maps as these complex tools of memory and identity. And the first map that that you showed with all the towns, the mapa likwidacji, the map of it was really, to me, fascinating, because we are all used to these maps of the sites of deaths, and of course these sites were the sites of deaths, likwidacja, the elimination of Jewish communities from there. But yet at the same time, it seems that they were mapping and inscribing the Jewish life onto the areas and maps from which they were erased. So this was really a fascinating, and the same way that the Yizker-Bikher seemed to be functioning to reinscribe Jewish life, not just Jewish death, onto these sites. I want to ask you, I want to start our conversation, and I hope our audience would chime in with questions and comments in the Q&A section of the screen. But I want to ask you about what you think maps can tell us as the sources of tools of memory. What can they reveal to us that other sources do not in the Holocaust studies?
I mean, I think it's the answer is like long and multi-layered. But what is, I think, the most compelling for me about maps is that they seem so obvious and they are not in so many respects. So I will answer first, talking a bit about something I already mentioned. I mean, I'm recently very much interested how Polish is like this kind of invisible language of Holocaust testimony that many that it can be understood that Polish survivors, Polish Jewish survivors spoke Polish, but they kind of actively chose not to use this language, and it somehow like fascinates me as a phenomenon that somehow sometimes in different situations this Polish emerges. For instance, I don't know, in Eichmann's trial, there is one moment when actually Ada Lichtman, one of the survivors from Sobibór, suddenly utters one word in Polish because she cannot find equivalent in Yiddish, and half of the room tells her what it is in Hebrew. So it is like this kind of underpinning of like Holocaust survival and especially Holocaust testimony. And this is why I think maps are interesting, because they somehow bring this Polish as this like strange language of betrayal, but also of personal attachment, and also like lets us exactly understand how like this attachment to space survived over time, and is like very complex phenomenon that is both painful and like tender. And this is one of the things that I think maps bring the most, like in the most visible way in the context of Holocaust testimony, is that like the experience is always like space bounded. So it's also remembering it like situates us towards some very specific space. So this is the one thing I would say. And the other is that I think we were very much used to the fact like Holocaust research focused on this kind of like a verbal form of testimony. Even video testimonies were transcribed to then be interpreted as sources. And if we focus on like visual representations, but visual representations that are much more complex and somehow like play with words as well, this lets us to understand like how much like testimony is a complex process, or that we should also think about like this not verbal but spatial, for instance, or gestural forms of testimony and ways of yes. So these two things, but of course there are many others.
Yeah, your comment about the language is fascinating, because as you were speaking, I was thinking about the language and about the bilingual aspect of these maps. And again, to me, they seemed to be tools of, again, inscribing that Jewish presence onto the towns from which Jewish life and presence has been erased. in that way, and that either replacing the language of the Polish language in some of those only maps that are only in Yiddish or only in Hebrew, but also in the bilingual maps that you discussed. This kind of inscribing that past and asserting that presence, and as you put it in your speak, legitimizing the narrative, legitimizing that past through these maps and through the language. I also would sort of wonder whether you could further reflect on why we've been ignoring maps as these, which I think I'm very persuaded, powerful tools of memory and testimony, and perhaps somewhat surprising, but really beautifully shown, maps as really important aspects of that memory for the survivors, right? As you mentioned that you got into this project by doing the interviews, and the survivors were invariably taking you to a map. So, and yet the scholarship, I mean, I'm not a historian of the Holocaust, but it seems as you are pioneering a new way of looking at these materials.
Yes, I will just like quickly come back to your previous comment also about like this legitimizing the interpretation of space. So I encountered one book that actually, because usually Yizker-Bikher are in Yiddish, Hebrew, very often with some English addition, but I actually found one book that has a Polish, like 20 pages. It's a book from Wieliczka, and in like sort of like a forward to this book, the authors are saying that they prepared also like this several pages in Polish, so Polish residents of the place can understand like how the Jewish past of this place looked like, that it had like illustrious inhabitants of from Jewish community, and how much they suffered during the Holocaust. And this is like very also interesting, like a type of the activity that you said, like this inscribing, and also like, but also like actively treating this space as our own. I think this is something that I really like, that like that somehow maps also like undermine this narrative that in 45 or like 56, 68, like that there is some kind of like end of Jewish Poland. Historian Kamil Kijek uses this term that we shouldn't think about teleology of like Jewish existence in Poland, but maps and Yizker-Bikher show that like this is still like Jewish space. These are like rightful residents who come back or who stay there and like repeat these gestures. So just a note to add. But answering your last question. Why the maps were ignored. I think they weren't really ignored. They were just used differently. I mean, maps were rather considered as as tools of military pursuit, and in general imagining the war in military terms. So there are like the Second World War was constantly mapped during the events. In press, there were like atlases published in the UK or in the US during the events, and showing like from this bird's eye the global war that was happening. And this is also important context for me, that I understood that like people I am dealing like with whose experience I'm dealing with, like the survivors, are actually people trained in maps, that their whole education went through maps. And one Holocaust survivor I spoke to told me that actually for him, like learning geography in school looked like that he had to like draw a map of Norway, for instance. And this is an important factor to understand, that they also like imagine themselves on the map constantly, because this is how their education worked. So coming back to answering properly the question, I would say that it's interesting how actually like the Holocaust was absent from maps for a very long time until actually Martin Gilbert's Atlas of the Holocaust. I portrayed him a bit here as a like a Schwarz character, but it's kind of not rightfully towards him because his first map is a bit strange with this Auschwitz only, but then in his atlas we have exactly like this very intimate and small scale mapping, like zooming in to Jewish space before and during the war. So I think his atlas is like the first time when actually Holocaust gets to mapping at all. So I would say it's a change of perspective, like from historians, geographers towards cultural scholars. I would like push agenda of cultural scholars in Holocaust research. Yes, and recently maps got very much on like got lots of audience because of the digital projects.
Right.
Yeah.
So as we're sort of winding down our discussion, I want to ask you to pivot to actually the space, the physical space, as it is now. You refer to it and as in your own experience growing up in a particular place. You mentioned these walking tours that are promoted in different ways, or walking as survivors walk. So I wonder how you might imagine in Poland, because that's the country we both know, and how you can imagine these maps that exist in the Yizker-Bikher become tools for local Polish communities and the local governments to utilize, to inscribe that Jewish past. I find that often we might have some memorial plaques mentioning the deportation of Jews or commemoration of the destruction of Jews, but often the sites of life are not kind of mapped out on the past of the town. Sometimes synagogues were destroyed, sometimes they are just empty spaces. So I wonder how you might imagine what would be a good way for Poland and Polish communities and Polish towns to take these maps and think about their internal kind of mapping for the now.
Yeah, so my imagination is based on things that already are happening and have happened. I'm thinking mostly about two like initiatives. One is the initiative of like gathering, like collecting like maps from Yizker-Bikher by Brama Grodzka in Lublin. This is a group of people who work a lot with like maps and try to like introduce in general like the memory of shtetl of shtetlach to like Polish consciousness, but also make these gestures towards communicating between people who come to visit and people who are in the place. So this is a great way of like doing that. Another initiative is the project by Natalia Romik, Polish artist and architect, who several years ago did a project that comprised exactly like it was like a moving kind of structure with maps of the places in Eastern Poland, and people from the local community could come and like find themselves on the map, because this is exactly, however banal, I think very powerful tool. I don't know if you like to find yourself in Google Maps and check where you were when you come back from your travel, but in general, people are united by this somehow pleasure of finding themselves on the map. And I think it's also a powerful like tool in, I don't know, memory and relations and politics, that actually like bringing people from now, like the survivors generation is almost gone, but in general, like people who can come, the descendants of like Jewish Poles, and people who are in the place, I think, like finding themselves together on the map, or like discussing or quarreling about maps, is the best like exercise to understand what happened.
But I assume it's not, it's also wrought with really difficulties because of the displacement and of replacement of property ownership and this sort of mapping people onto that might be difficult. And I imagine that's also behind some of the resistance why some localities may not want to deeply engage with these maps and those memories and the inscription of the Jewish presence onto the towns.
Sadly, yes. Yeah.
But
we
so yeah, we have a couple of questions, and I'll and then we'll wrap up. One is Yizker, one of our members of the audience and a friend of Fordham Center, Hadassah Weiner, is asking, the Yizker-Bikher I have from Sokolka allows a Russian church and a Polish church as well as a Christian cemetery. Did you find such places on the maps you studied? So I guess the inclusion of the Christian places and Christian sites in the maps.
Yes, I mean, these topographies vary. Sometimes they're absolutely included. Sometimes they're a bit diminished, and we can see the scale that like Jewish presence is like underlined, and let's say like Polish or Ukrainian or Russian a bit put like in a like lighter colors, let's say, figuratively. So yes, it depends on the creators. Like this is a very variegated corpus, but very often it's actually like yes, like many communities live in these maps, even if the maps are like a monument for Jewish community in particular. So
and therefore inscribing the sort of shared past, shared history in that way.
yeah.
So I want to thank you so much. I very much look forward to your book, and when it comes out, we should have you back for a book launch. And I thank everybody for coming, and I hope you will join us next week and then weeks after for all our future events and for the New York Public Library in Fordham lecture series. And thank you so much, Ola, for this wonderful presentation and sharing this really fascinating and very, very moving and sophisticated ways of looking at these materials. So thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.